Hello. Oh, I'm a little bit early. I thought I'd planned this perfectly. Alrighty. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am one of two lead faculty in our modern management of the older adult geriatric. Happy Wednesday. This is Geri on Ice Day. We have our May cohort of modern management of the older adult essential foundations starting today. That is a sold out cohort. If you are interested in jumping into our 8-week online course, our next opportunity is going to be in June. And we're already about 25% sold out, which is really fantastic. We're so excited. We also have some live courses coming up. We are going to be in Arizona on Father's Day weekend, June 19th, 20th. That's, I think, our next open course coming up. So we're super, super excited to be able to share this material in person with you all. And we are working actually on a major revamp for this course. Okay, today, what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was blending strength and conditioning principles with concepts in geriatrics, and why that's particularly important given what we know about aging physiology. Number one, I think this is a huge issue in geriatric practice. All of a sudden, we think that every construct that we have learned in strength and conditioning no longer applies once a person hits the age of 65. And why do I say that? Because we see this pervasive underdosing that's happening across the spectrum of geriatric care. We talk about this a lot, but what we're also seeing is that some of these tried and true principles that we're seeing in the strength and conditioning world aren't translating into our geriatric plans of care. What are those principles? So number one, we're going to be looking at things like progressive overload, looking at sets and reps and how they translate into the ultimate goal of the person that you are working with, use it or lose it principles, and adaptability. I think those are the four. In terms of what I think we as geriatric clinicians are doing well, usually we are pretty good in the specificity world. Sometimes we can do very, very well in acute care and in different home care settings around being able to get individuals working on transfers and bed mobility and ambulation, community ambulation, etc. But sometimes our exercises that we choose, because they're underdosed, don't have that same translation that I would love to see. An example is if we choose to do a seated long arm quad, when we could choose to do a banded knee extension in standing. If our goal for our client is that they want to have more standing endurance, then I'm going to be doing everything in my power to be getting them up for as long as I can during my session with them. And so if all of my patients' goals are related to standing transverse movement and they're seated for the majority of their exercise program, there's something that's being lost in translation, and there's probably a better exercise that we can select. Oftentimes I use seated exercise once I've gotten to a point in my session where my client, who could be extremely deconditioned, is beginning to fatigue so much that in order for them to voluntarily continue exercising with me, we're going to take the intensity down to a seated exercise. But even then, I'm going to try and work on different transfer skills. So working on supersetting seated exercises with an exercise that's in supine, because then as I transfer back and forth between these movements, I'm still getting a bit of dosage of transfer training, and that can be really important too. But in general, I would say kind of one thing that we as geriatric clinicians are doing well is that specificity piece. The thing that I think we are not doing well, and this is kind of going back to that 3x10, 3x12 exercise prescription, is that we're not setting our sets and reps in our exercise programs related directly to the goal of the older adult. And you all know my bias. If you've heard me talk on the podcast before, you know that I think it's extremely important for us to expose older adults to higher loads in rep ranges that are less than 6, because all the strength and conditioning literature shows that in order for us to improve overall raw strength, we need to expose them to heavy loads for low repetitions. And that is one way that we are going to be able to hugely combat 1 rep max living. Why is this important? This comes back to one, the underlying mechanism for how we generate strength, overall body strength, and 2, aging physiology. And those are the 2 things that I want to talk about today. So number 1, when we think about what is happening in the neuromuscular system as a person gets older, we see a preferential loss of type 2 fibers. These are those fast twitch, quick reacting fibers for a preferred ratio of type 1 endurance postural muscle fibers that are on at a baseline lower level for longer periods of time. In order for us to try and mitigate some of those changes, which is super important for things like falls recovery, we need to create a stimulus that is going to activate those type 2 fibers, which means we have to work on power and we have to ramp up above the threshold of all of our type 1 fibers so that we can start activating some of our type 2 fibers as well. That's number 1, that's going to be really important, and I'm going to loop this back into the rep ranges. Number 2 is we see a loss of neuromuscular pruning that is happening, where we lose some of the connections in that motor unit. So instead of having a motor unit with 20 cells that are attached to it, we start to see that this becomes less and less. And what we also see is that the mechanism for strength development in older adults is often related to neuromuscular efficiency rather than changes in cross-sectional area contingent to things like hypertrophy. Both of these things are extremely important because in order for us to maintain neuromuscular efficiency and kind of try to encourage more neuromuscular maintenance, maintaining those motor unit numbers and connections, we want to make sure that we are using as many of those motor units as possible within a given muscle. That means that we need to provide a stimulus that is going to utilize as many motor units as possible in that activity. What that means is we need to be working on overall body strength and keeping our rep ranges in that 6 and under. I usually stick between 3 and 6. I don't usually do a lot of 1 rep maxes. Why? In muscular physiology, in strength and conditioning, we know that all of a sudden my Instagram crashed. I'm gonna have to do this again. We know that as we increase the amount of loading, we increase the amount of muscle fibers that are recruited and the amount of motor units that are turned on in order for us to see improvements and see that strength gain. If we are working at 60% of our 1 repetition maximum, 60% of our muscle fibers and 60% of our motor units are going to be recruited. If we are trying to save and optimize the amount of motor units that a person is keeping into older age, that means we need to provide a stimulus that activates across all motor units and all muscular fibers on a regular basis. If we do not, then what we start to see is that our body says, okay, well, we don't need these anymore. They're expensive to maintain, and they're going to be the ones that we lose. What that means is if we are not going into high strength loads, and we're only using our postural endurance rep ranges, then we're only going to be keeping those motor units, we're only going to be keeping those muscle fibers, and we're not going to be maintaining those ancillary motor units that we really want to keep in order to maintain reactive control and allow us to continue strengthening across the cross-section of the muscle. And what that means is if we look at muscular physiology of an aging person, a person who is getting older, and we see what is the best way for us to mitigate some of these changes, the underlying muscular physiology and mechanism from a strength and conditioning perspective in that rep range of 3 to 6 repetitions is going to optimize some of those changes. This can be kind of scary, but if we recognize that it is extremely important for our clients who are at risk, almost more important than so many other things that we are worrying about, it kind of gives us justification for why we are doing what we are doing. So if we know that the underlying physiology mechanisms for individuals who are experiencing frailty and sarcopenia, which is clinical muscular weakness related to aging and not pathology, though I would argue that pathology is going to just exacerbate these processes and not necessarily change the mechanism, then we have a good justification for why, when we think about our exercise program, we're prioritizing loading and keeping those rep ranges lower. And what that means is that we can expose individuals to higher percentages of their 1 rep max. As you increase the weight, you're going to increase the number of motor units and muscular fibers that are activated across the cross-sectional area of whatever muscle group you are trying to strengthen, and you're going to be able to maintain and optimize the amount of motor units maintained, and type 2 fibers continue to be recruited as we get older. If we never expose our older adults to power training, for example, which is working through a range of motion quickly, this would be on a lower percentage of 1 rep max, but that's a whole other topic. Or we never expose our clients to slower strength training in the 6 and under rep range, we could be leaving so much on the table. And that doesn't mean that I don't use these endurance rep ranges. I absolutely do. But for some of those big lifts, like optimizing and going to the most challenging floor transfer permutation that I can, the squat if I'm trying to work on loading, the hinge patterns, push-up patterns, trying to not make sure that a person could do a wall push-up for 20, that they can do an elevated push-up to a lower surface for 5. Those types of tiny changes in your programming can make massive differences for the independence and capacity of some of our older adults. And that's what I wanted to leave you all with today, is we sometimes don't necessarily think about strength and conditioning principles because we think about them for the adult, but I almost think they're more important when we start layering in some of these complex chronic conditions, and not to mention what happens very normally with age and how we want to square that curve. We talk about this all the time in the modern management course around we want to live long and die fast. We want to avoid 1 rep max living, and we want to square that curve where we're not seeing this gradual decline. We're seeing this optimized state of physical function and then a quick decline when a person is ready to leave this world. And this is the best way, in my opinion, that we can do that. And it's not easy sometimes, and some clients might be a bit hesitant, but the more you start exposing and normalizing some of these exercises within your toolbox, the easier it gets to expose them. All right, Facebook, you were keeping with me. I don't know what happened to Instagram. It just crashed, so I'm going to be redoing this. So if you want to hear this again, probably in a different way, over on Instagram, you absolutely can. If you are interested in our modern management of the older adult essential foundations, I encourage you to sign up for our June cohort. If you have not signed up, we have our Modern Management of the Older Adult Digest, which is a bi-weekly, so 2 times a month, email that talks about the latest literature that is coming out in the world of geriatrics. So it's basically like a hump day hustling that's specific to the geriatric world. And we encourage you all to sign up for that because it is a great way for us to stay connected to what's going on in the research space, and it's going to allow us to practice at the top of our license. All right, I hope that was helpful for you all. Enjoy the rest of this wonderful Wednesday, and I will see you all very soon.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.